In September 1683, all of Europe trembled before a colossal storm of war sweeping westward. The Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful forces in the world at the time, had gathered its might to deliver a fatal blow, a strike straight at the very heart of Central Europe, the city of Vienna. For nearly 2 centuries, the Ottomans had spread terror across the continent, from Constantinople to Budapest, from the Balkans to the banks of the Danube. Armies marching under the crescent flag had crushed fortress after fortress, kingdom after kingdom. To them, Vienna was not just a city, it was the gateway to Europe itself. If Vienna fell, nothing could stop them from pushing further, into Germany, into Italy, even as far as Paris. Yet, standing at that threshold of history, Vienna was at its most fragile. Along the Danube in the early months of 1683, villagers spoke of endless columns of soldiers, warhorses pounding like thunder, banners blotting out the sky, drums beating like the heartbeat of some monstrous engine. The army brought by Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Sultan, was recorded at around 150,000 men, an overwhelming number by the standards of 17th century Europe. Within that host were the finest warriors of the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries' elite infantry, famed for iron discipline and ruthless efficiency. The Sipahi, heavily armored cavalry wielding curved blades of legend, and tens of thousands of Tatar horsemen from the steppes, feared for their savagery and speed. Behind them rolled siege wagons, artillery, miners, engineers, all the machinery required for a long and grinding siege. European chroniclers later wrote that the Ottoman camp sprawled like a second city, with silk tents embroidered in gold, wooden watchtowers, and even fountains within the command pavilion. This was not merely an army, it was an empire on the move. In stark contrast to this might, Vienna, the capital of the Habsburgs, could muster only about 20,000 defenders. Barely 15,000 were trained soldiers, the rest were citizen militia, craftsmen, peasants, merchants, men who had never dreamed they would one day stand atop city walls, facing an enemy 7 times their number. The city still had its stone ramparts and bastions, built generations earlier, but could these walls withstand the weight of such a human tide? Whispers in the dark carried the same fear. No fortress in Europe could endure the Ottomans for long. And in the very moment Vienna needed a king's leadership most, Emperor Leopold I made a decision that history would never forget. On July 7th, as the Ottoman vanguard drew near, Leopold and his court fled westward. Carriages laden with treasure, archives, and nobles thundered across the bridges in desperate flight. The people watched in silence, their hearts sinking. The Habsburg Empire, the pride of Europe, had abandoned its own heart. Vienna was left to its fate. That fate now rested on the shoulders of Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. Only 36 years old, he faced an almost impossible task: to hold Vienna until relief could arrive. Starhemberg was no crowned monarch, no legendary general with endless legions. He commanded only 20,000 against a sea of steel and fire. Yet he possessed what the Ottomans could not measure: a will of iron and absolute loyalty to his city. From the moment he took command, Starhemberg moved swiftly. He reinforced walls, stockpiled what food he could, and organized the populace into auxiliaries. Masons became engineers, blacksmiths became armorers. He walked the streets, encouraging the fearful, swearing that Vienna would fight to the very end. Far beyond the horizon, the Ottoman banners swept northward through the Balkans. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground. Villages that surrendered were stripped of food, their men forced into service, their women and children sold into bondage. Tales of slaughter traveled faster than the armies themselves, so that many towns stood abandoned before the crescent banners even appeared. By July, from Vienna's watchtowers, clouds of dust rose on the horizon. An immense column of men and beasts rolled forward, a living tidal wave of flesh, steel, and fire. When the Ottoman camp finally rose outside the walls, stretching to the horizon itself, the defenders understood. They were surrounded. There would be no retreat, no allies to lean upon. All that remained was this city, these walls of stone, and the will of those left behind. Vienna was no longer just a city, It was the front line of an entire civilization. All of Europe looked toward it, breathless. If it fell, nothing could stop the Ottomans from flooding deeper into the continent. Was there a king brave enough to answer the call? Would any army arrive before Vienna crumbled into ashes? In those fateful days, a colossal confrontation was set in motion. On one side stood the mightiest empire of the age, its armies like the sea. On the other, a single beleaguered city, abandoned, holding on with 20,000 stubborn souls and one young commander. And above all loomed the question, would Vienna become Europe's grave or the birthplace of one of its greatest victories? The summer sky of 1683 hung heavy over Vienna. Each morning as the sun climbed over the horizon, the deep roll of Ottoman war drums and the eerie blast of their horns echoed from outside the walls. They were not mere sounds, they were a constant reminder that a vast army waited beyond, eager to crush the city. Within days, the fields around Vienna transformed into another city, a vast camp of silk tents and crescent banners filled with the neighing of horses, the clatter of steel, and the grinding of artillery being hauled into place. At its center stood Kara Mustafa Pasha's grand pavilion, embroidered with gold, laid with red carpets, and even adorned with a fountain, luxury flaunted like an insult against the starving city. The Ottomans began their siege by severing all lifelines. Every road into the city was cut, the Danube was blockaded, barges were sunk or seized, Vienna was slowly strangled, like prey caught in the talons of a giant beast. The bombardment shook the walls day and night, but the greater danger came from below. Ottoman sappers tunneled under the bastions, filling chambers with gunpowder. Each detonation tore gaps in the defenses, sending towers crashing in flame and rubble. Panic surged, but Starhemberg responded with grim resolve. When a tower fell, its ruins were piled into barricades. When a breach opened, women, children, and the elderly carried stones, timber, even the bodies of the dead, to plug the gap. Vienna became a living organism, desperately patching its own wounds no matter the pain. With each passing day, supplies dwindled. Rations shrank to crusts of bread and foul water. People boiled horseflesh, ate dogs and cats, even chewed leather just to survive. Water became more precious than gold. The Danube was lost, wells ran dry, and citizens collected rainwater or scooped it from muddy pits in cellars. Disease followed swiftly. Fevers and dysentery swept through the cramped underground shelters where thousands huddled during bombardments. At night, the city lay in darkness. People sat in silence, straining to hear the enemy digging beneath their feet. Then came the earth-shaking roar of another mine exploding, collapsing walls and homes alike. Children cried, prayers rose, and the screams of the wounded filled the air, a grim chorus of survival. In utter desperation, Vienna turned every citizen into a warrior. On the ramparts stood not only soldiers, but also blacksmiths, carpenters, merchants, and even women, their dresses stained with blood, carrying buckets of water and stones in their hands. Children darted through the chaos, delivering ammunition and messages between bastions. At times, bands of women hurled boiling oil or quicklime down onto Ottoman sappers as they tried to set their siege ladders against the walls. Starhemberg knew he could not rely on soldiers alone. He transformed the entire city into a war machine. Every house became a fortress, every citizen a spear. The strange thing was that, even in misery, the will to fight never died. Because above all, Vienna had one burning flame: Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. He did not hide in safety. He was often seen atop the walls, among fire and smoke. His face blackened by gunpowder, his cloak torn to shreds, he still roared words of defiance. Vienna will never surrender. He walked the trenches, shaking the hands of soldiers, patting the shoulders of trembling townsfolk, lifting up crying children. His very presence was proof. Though the enemy outnumbered them 7-1, though enemy guns tore holes in their walls, the city still had not fallen. Each time the Ottomans built new works or dug new mines, Viennese soldiers opened the gates and launched lightning counterattacks. At night, small raiding parties slipped out, setting fire to Ottoman cannons, wrecking wooden bridges, slaying guards, then vanishing back into the dark. These raids, tiny compared to the Great Siege, nevertheless gnawed at Kara Mustafa's patience. This city, rather than cowering, kept biting back like a beast cornered. Time dragged. For 2 months, Vienna lived in the shadow of death. More than 200 times the walls shook with explosions, dozens of towers collapsed, yet each time new defenders stepped forward to fill the gaps. Outside, Kara Mustafa remained patient. He avoided costly full-scale assaults, confident that starvation would do his work for him. But his hesitation became Vienna's one chance at survival. Inside, Starhemberg kept the flame alive. In one letter smuggled out, he declared, "We will fight to the last man. No white flag shall ever fly upon these walls." Vienna was like a candle in a storm, its flame flickering between life and death. Yet even as food ran out, even as death stalked every street, a strange faith spread among the people. They whispered that somewhere armies were marching toward them. Perhaps from Germany, from Poland, from distant kingdoms. Someone must have heard their cry. And so, they clenched their teeth and endured, holding on day by day. The siege of Vienna was not just a battle. It was a story of survival, of a small city rising to defy a mighty empire. It was proof that even in the darkest despair, humans can ignite a flame. The proud flame named "Vienna will never surrender." Inside Vienna, the walls cracked under bombardment, the streets choked with smoke and blood. But beyond the forests, mountains and rivers, the city's cry did not stop at Austria's borders. It echoed across the continent, reverberating through every throne, cathedral and castle, challenging Europe to choose: rise up or watch Vienna fall. Vienna was not just a capital, it was the gateway to the very core of the Holy Roman Empire. If it collapsed, the gates would swing wide open and the Ottoman tide would surge westward. Bavaria, Saxony, even the Rhine itself would tremble. Scouts carried grim tidings to royal courts. Vienna is besieged. The Ottoman host is as endless as the sea. Like a storm, the news swept across Europe, sowing dread that soon crescent flags might fly above Gothic cathedrals, church bells silenced beneath the swords of conquerors. In desperation, Emperor Leopold I, who had fled Vienna, sent out letters of appeal. They were not merely pleas, but dire warnings. If Vienna falls, the whole of Europe will shake. In the past, Europe had always been divided: Catholics against Protestants, kings against kings, dynasties feuding with dynasties. But in 1683, that division had to pause because a voice rose from Rome. Pope Innocent XV saw the siege of Vienna not just as politics, but as a struggle for survival, for all Christendom. To him, Vienna was not merely a city crying out, it was the new Jerusalem, a fortress of faith. If it fell, the spiritual foundations of Europe would crack. From the Holy See, he called on kings, princes, and nobles to put aside grudges and unite beneath a single banner, the Holy League. This was not just a military coalition, but a new crusade, one in which old enemies would fight shoulder to shoulder for something greater than crowns, the survival of civilization itself. But not all answered at once. Many rulers hesitated, bound by selfish calculations. Some thought, why should I sacrifice soldiers to save Vienna when the Habsburgs themselves have neglected us before? That hesitation nearly sealed Vienna's fate. For 2 long months, the city could only pray for a miracle, and at last that miracle came, from the north, from the Polish plains. His name was John III Sobieski, King of Poland. To the Polish people, he was not only a monarch, but a warrior, a commander who had fought the Ottomans and Tatars across many battlefields. 10 years earlier, Sobieski had carved his legend at the Battle of Chocim, where he shattered an Ottoman army far larger than his own. He was famed not as a king who sat idle on a throne, but as one who fought in the saddle, sword in hand, among his men. To them, he was the king in the saddle, a ruler of blood, sweat, and steel. When Vienna's plea reached him, many Polish nobles objected. We already have enough troubles at home. Why risk our lives for Austria? But Sobieski answered with a line still remembered today. Whoever saves Vienna, saves Poland. If the city falls, tomorrow the Ottomans will be in Krakow in Warsaw. It was a decision not just for an ally, but for the very future of his people. And with it, he turned the wheel of history. Under the Pope's persuasion and Sobieski's resolve, The pieces of the Holy League began to fall into place. Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, lands once bitter rivals, now pledged troops. The Holy Roman Empire, fractured though it was, gathered its forces. Thus from division came unity, fragile but real, and from the north rode a king who would soon carve his name into legend, John III Sobieski, the man who would lead Europe's last hope to Vienna. It was an alliance riddled with contradictions, where commanders quarreled in a dozen tongues, and where mutual suspicion still lingered. Yet before the colossal threat of the Ottomans, they all understood. Unless they stood shoulder to shoulder, one by one, their nations would be devoured. The sight of Polish envoys galloping to every court, carrying word that their king had pledged to march for Vienna, lit sparks of hope across the continent. Inside the besieged city, secret letters smuggled out declared, "We will endure, come quickly." And far away, Sobieski began his great march. Tens of thousands of Polish horsemen, among them the legendary Winged Hussars, warriors with eagle-feathered wings rising from their backs, prepared to ride south. They carried not only lances and sabers, but also a promise. Vienna would not stand alone. In every chapel and cathedral, bells tolled prayers. Clergy preached that this was not merely the defense of one city, but the salvation of all Christian civilization. In distant villages, peasants whispered tales of the king on the white horse from the north, a figure of myth who would bring deliverance. These half-legendary stories spread quickly, turning John Sobieski into a living symbol of hope. While Kara Mustafa remained convinced that Vienna would collapse from hunger, rescue armies were closing in with each passing day. Europe, fractured though it was, now held its breath. Everything would be decided in a single battle, whether the crescent or the cross would rule over Europe. And at the heart of this hope stood none other than the King of Poland, John III Sobieski, willing to risk his crown and his nation to save Vienna. The cry from Vienna had not fallen into the void. It had become a rallying bell, transforming fear into resolve, turning divided kingdoms into an alliance. And most importantly, it found the one man bold enough to answer, "I will come." September 1683. While Vienna's walls shuddered under Ottoman bombardment, hundreds of kilometers away, an army was quietly assembling. It was not a single nation's force, but a precarious union of states, territories, and dynasties that had long distrusted and even hated one another. Yet this time, facing a common doom, they were compelled to fight side by side. It became known as the Holy League, a coalition unlike anything Europe had seen before. The Holy Roman Empire was fractured among dozens of small principalities, each with its own prince, its own politics. Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, all had clashed repeatedly over land, faith, and power. Even Austria, the Habsburg stronghold at Vienna's center, had rarely earned its neighbors' trust. But now they were forced to sit at the same table, not out of friendship, but out of fear. If Vienna fell, all of them would one by one be carved up by the Ottoman sword. In that chaos, one man rose to bind them together, John III Sobieski, King of Poland. He brought not only 30,000 cavalry and infantry, but the authority of a warrior king who had already bested the Ottomans more than once. Sobieski was unlike most monarchs who ruled from gilded thrones. He was the king in the saddle, living with his soldiers, eating their rations, riding into battle at their side. To his men, he was the very image of courage, of leadership by deed rather than decree. When German princes still eyed one another with suspicion, Sobieski's presence forced them to set aside their quarrels. Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, Franconians, Swabians, peoples who had never imagined fighting shoulder to shoulder, now shared the same campfires. Yet this alliance was fragile, as thin as ice. In councils of war, generals argued over who would command the center, who would guard the rear, who would claim the honor of leading the charge. Languages clashed, orders were garbled. Nobles squabbled over prestige, over the spoils of victory before it was even won. Sobieski knew if a firm hand did not guide them, the alliance would shatter before it ever reached Vienna. He often rose, his voice ringing across the command tent. "This is no time to seek glory. This is the time to save Vienna, to save Europe. Tomorrow, if we fail, none of us will have crowns to sit upon, nor lands to rule." His words struck like a hammer upon their pride, silencing dukes and princes alike. Slowly, the alliance began to move as one. More than 70,000 soldiers began their grueling journey. They crossed forests, plains and rivers under searing days and freezing nights. The thunder of hooves echoed on stone roads, while cannon wheels shrieked against mud and rock. Villagers watched in awe and hope. Never had they seen such a host, armor of every shape and color, banners of every design. There were Polish warriors with vast feathered wings arching from their backs, the Winged Hussars, living legends of Europe. There were heavy-armored German infantry with great swords glinting. There were disciplined Austrian cavalry, banners snapping in the wind, all melded into one unwieldy but immense force, trudging steadily toward Vienna. Each step was a message to the besieged city. Couriers galloped ahead, breaking through Ottoman lines to carry word inside. "Relief is coming! Hold on a little longer!" In dark shelters beneath shattered walls, Viennese clasped hands, tears streaming down their faces. For the first time in weeks of despair, they believed they had not been abandoned. That belief spread like fire, becoming strength to patch another breach, to raise another barricade. After weeks of harsh marching, the Allied host at last reached the banks of the Danube, the final barrier between them and Vienna. The river roared, reflecting the pale light of the moon. The entire army would have to cross if they were to strike the Ottoman lines. That night, torches flared against the darkness as soldiers waded into the swirling current, war horses snorting, artillery dragged by sheer human and animal strength. On the bank, Sobieski sat astride his horse, eyes gleaming, lips pressed tight. He knew every hour lost meant Vienna inched closer to death. At dawn on September 10, 1683, all 70,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the river. They pitched camp upon the hills overlooking Vienna, where grey smoke rose from smouldering bastions and the thunder of explosions still echoed without pause. Before them, Vienna still stood, trembling, battered, but unbroken. And beyond its walls, the Ottoman encampment stretched like an ocean, filling the fields, blotting out the horizon with tens of thousands of banners. In that moment, all understood. The confrontation was at hand. On one side, the mightiest empire of the age. On the other, a fragile alliance only newly forged. Yet both knew this battle would decide not only the fate of a city, but the course of European history. The Christian alliance had arrived. Vienna was no longer alone. And within days, the world would witness one of the greatest battles of all time. Dawn, September 12, 1683. As the first light pierced the forests around Vienna, the valley shook with drums, horns, and the cries of men preparing for war. After nearly 2 months of siege, today Vienna's fate, and perhaps Europe's, would be sealed. In the Ottoman camp, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha stood over a map spread across a silk carpet. He gazed toward the shattered city, black smoke billowing from walls crushed by artillery. With some 120,000 soldiers, elite Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, Tatar horsemen and contingents drawn from across the empire, he believed the day's work would be but a formality. To Kara Mustafa, Vienna was already broken. Its people starved, its defenders wounded and weary. He was confident that the Christian alliance, though 70,000 strong, could never shatter the vast encirclement prepared over months. Victory, he thought, was only a matter of time. But on the green hills to the north, another plan had taken shape. John III Sobieski, King of Poland, and the Allied commanders had devised a three-pronged assault. Left flank, Imperial forces under Charles of Lorraine would strike the northern lines, closest to Vienna. Center, German units from Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia would advance through the thick forests and drive into the Ottoman center. Right flank, Sobieski held in reserve the secret trump card, 20,000 Polish cavalry, among them the legendary Winged Hussars, hidden in the woods until the decisive moment. It was a gamble. If one prong failed, the entire Allied line could be crushed, but Sobieski knew only boldness could save Vienna. As the sun rose higher, the first cannons boomed. On the left, Imperial troops stormed down from the ridges, clashing with entrenched Ottoman lines. From within Vienna, Starhemberg's garrison launched furious sorties, bursting through gates to burn siege works and support the relief. In the center, German forces emerged from the forests, colliding with Ottoman formations amid fire and smoke. Cannons thundered, the stench of sulfur filled the air, and thousands of muskets flared, turning the valley into a sea of white smoke. The Ottomans countered swiftly, unleashing the Janissaries. With iron discipline, they advanced in solid ranks, beating war drums that made even veteran soldiers shudder. From morning until noon, the battlefield became a furnace of death. On the left, Imperial troops strained to push forward, but met ferocious resistance. In the center, ground was won and lost by inches, every yard paid for in blood, bodies piled into gruesome ramparts. The clash of steel, the pounding hooves, the screams of dying men, all merged into a single cacophony. German contingents were nearly annihilated under Janissary pressure, while swarms of Tatar cavalry harassed both flanks, forcing the Allied line to waver again and again. Yet the alliance did not break. Step by step, counterattack by counterattack, they forced the Ottomans back from their strongest positions. By mid-afternoon, the balance began to shift. From within Vienna, Starhemberg's defenders launched daring sorties, torching Ottoman cannon, sabotaging trenches. Now the invaders had to fight both the besiegers outside and the city within. On the Allied left, troops pushed closer to the walls, opening a corridor that linked relief forces with the defenders. Vienna had not fallen, and now it began to strike back. Kara Mustafa still trusted in numbers, but reality gnawed at his camp. Reports flooded in. The left is breaking. The center is being pushed back. Exhaustion spread among soldiers who had fought since dawn. Defensive lines gave ground inch by inch. Still, Kara Mustafa refused to commit his full reserves, waiting for what he thought would be the decisive moment. But his hesitation gave Sobieski the chance he had been waiting for. All that day on the right flank, 20,000 Polish cavalry remained concealed within the forests. Horses snorted, armor gleamed, and on their backs rose vast wooden frames bristling with eagle feathers, the Winged Hussars. Their wings were not mere display. When thousands charged at once, the rushing wind through feathers created a dreadful hiss like the roar of thunder. Enemies heard it and quaked, horses panicked, ranks broke before steel even struck. Sobieski waited with patience. He knew he must let the Ottomans bleed, let their lines falter, before unleashing the final blow. As the sun sank westward, both sides were near collapse. Corpses carpeted the field, smoke and fire veiled the sky. Yet in that chaos, Sobieski saw the sign he awaited. The Ottoman flanks were beginning to crack. He turned to his generals and gave the order. The time has come, let the world see our strength. The Polish cavalry formed ranks, thousands of lances and sabers glittering in the sunset. Hussars bent low in their saddles, ready for the gallop. Far below, the Ottoman camp had no inkling of the storm about to descend. The horns sounded. The forest echoed with the thunder of hooves. The earth trembled. White wings spread wide, shrieking in the wind like the cry of avenging angels. And from the heights, 20,000 horsemen plunged down, like lightning from the heavens, straight into the heart of the Ottoman army. On that day, September 12th, 1683, the battlefield of Vienna became the stage for the largest cavalry charge in European history. And at its very tip rode John III Sobieski, the king who turned an entire continent from despair to hope. That afternoon, as the crimson sun sank beyond the horizon, its blood-red light spilled across the forests surrounding Vienna. All day long, the battlefield had been hell itself. Tens of thousands had fallen. The valley was stained with blood, the sky smothered by smoke. The Ottomans, though greater in number, had begun to waver under the relentless pressure of the Christian alliance. Yet the battle was not yet decided. It was then that John III Sobieski, King of Poland, unleashed his trump card. On the slopes of Kahlenberg, hidden in the forest, 20,000 Polish horsemen waited with bated breath. These were no ordinary cavalry. These were Europe's legendary warriors, the Winged Hussars. Clad in gleaming armor, mounted on war horses, They carried lances more than 5 meters long, and from their backs rose great wings, crafted of eagle feathers. When thousands of those wings rattled in the wind, they produced a shrieking roar like thunder, a sound that sowed terror long before the charge struck home. The warriors lowered their visors and gripped their reins. War horses screamed, hooves pounding the earth as if urging to be released. All awaited a single signal. Sobieski, astride his white charger, stood at the point of the formation. He drew his sword, its steel flashing in the twilight, then dropped it. The signal was given. Horns blared. The hill itself shook. 20,000 horsemen thundered forward, hooves exploding like rolling storms, dust rising in great clouds, wings shrieking as they tore the air. It was the greatest cavalry charge in European history. From afar, the Ottomans looked up and froze. They had fought infantry all day long, but none had imagined this, a living wall of steel and feathers descending like a tidal wave. The Sipahi cavalry scrambled to form lines, raising shields. The Janissaries leveled muskets and fired volley after volley. But even as the first shots rang out, the Polish horsemen did not falter. The shrieking of wings drowned the crack of guns, and as the gap closed, the battlefield exploded. The moment the hussars struck the Ottoman ranks, the earth itself seemed to quake. Thousands of lances smashed into enemy formations. Cavalry lines were ripped apart. Infantry shattered like sand before a steel tsunami. War horses barreled through, trampling everything beneath them. Swords, axes, lances flashed in every direction. The clash of steel, the screams of men, the shrieks of beasts all fused into a chaos beyond description. From his command pavilion, Kara Mustafa saw it all. The armies that had stood proud only hours before were shredded within minutes. He ordered reserves forward, but they too were swallowed by the hurricane of hussars, like dry branches swept into a flood. The hussars fought not only with lances and swords, but with their image. To the enemy, the wings, the roar, the storm made them seem not human, but supernatural, avenging angels of destruction. Ottoman horses panicked, bolting. Even the iron ranks of the Janissaries began to splinter. The Battle of Mines was won before the Battle of Blades had ended. Sobieski himself led the spear point, cutting into the Ottoman center. He did not hide behind his men, but rode in front, swinging his sword like a common warrior. His courage ignited the army behind him, and the charge became unstoppable. Once the hussars broke through the first defensive line, German, Austrian, and Bavarian cavalry poured in to exploit the breach. The Ottomans, already drained by the days-long fight, collapsed entirely. Across the wide plains, tens of thousands of Turks fled in panic. They cast away armor, abandoned artillery, even treasures from their camp. What had once been the proud symbol of Ottoman might now dissolved into a rout. Kara Mustafa still tried to issue orders, but his commands were lost in the chaos. Couriers could not reach their units. Standards vanished in the storm of dust and smoke. As the hussars stormed toward the Grand Command tent, the luxurious pavilion of the vizier himself, Kara Mustafa knew it was over. He fled, leaving behind camp, cannons, and stores. The Ottoman Empire, so certain it would plant its crescent banner upon Vienna within days, now scattered like a broken mob. From the walls of Vienna, soldiers and citizens saw the miracle unfold. They watched the crescent banners torn apart, saw the Polish cavalry with white wings crashing through like a tempest. Cheers erupted louder than cannon fire. Many wept, clinging to one another. After 2 months in hell, they had seen salvation. That charge did not only save Vienna, it saved Europe. As the sun sank fully into the west, the battle was over. The Ottomans fled east, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead, thousands of cannons, their entire camp. The Christian alliance, thanks to Sobieski's decisive strike, had turned a desperate siege into a resounding victory. In a letter to the Pope after the battle, Sobieski wrote, "Venimus vidimus Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered. The decisive blow, the charge of the Winged Hussars, was more than a military triumph. It became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes, in the darkest moment, history can turn upon a single strike. And that strike, on September 12, 1683, took the shape of white wings descending from Kahlenberg Hill. When the sun finally vanished beyond the horizon that day, the battlefield of Vienna was no longer filled with the beating of war drums or the shouts of men, but with the ruin of shattered ambition. Only hours before, the Ottomans had believed they would soon raise the crescent over Vienna's walls. Now they fled in chaos, abandoning the pride of a mighty empire. The fields once darkened by Ottoman tents and banners had become the graveyard of their ambition. Heavy cannons lay stuck in the mud, unmoved. Thousands of wagons of grain and powder stood abandoned. Gold-threaded carpets, silver vessels, even the fountain from Kara Mustafa's tent, all left behind in a panicked flight. The warriors who had once spread terror across Europe were now broken. The Sipahi, the cavalry once praised as invincible, were crushed beneath the hooves of the Winged Hussars. The Janissaries, the empire's most elite soldiers, were driven back and swallowed by the vortex of death, unable to form even a final line of defense. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, who had once boasted that Vienna would fall in a matter of weeks, now had only one path left: flight. Few images in history are as symbolic as this: a vast empire collapsing in a single moment beneath the weight of courage and bold strategy. Inside the city, when the defenders realized the Ottomans had fled, a thunder of cheers shook the streets. After nearly 2 months of starvation and despair, the people could finally breathe safety. Many embraced, tears streaming down their faces, while church bells rang across the city. The surviving soldiers, exhausted and wounded, leaned against the walls, staring at the fields where the enemy camp had once stood. They could hardly believe they had endured so long. 58 consecutive days of bombardment, famine, disease, and explosions from Ottoman mines. Now all that remained was a haunting memory. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the young commander who had sworn that Vienna would never surrender, was hailed as a hero. He had kept his promise. The city had not fallen, and because of that, all of Europe still stood. The victory at Vienna was more than the salvation of one city. It was a turning point, a historic full stop to the Ottoman Empire's ambition of pushing deeper into Europe. Until then, the Turks believed no fortress could withstand their might. From Constantinople to Belgrade to Budapest, great cities had crumbled beneath Ottoman hooves. If Vienna had fallen, nothing would have stopped them from advancing into Germany, into Italy, perhaps even into Paris. But after September 12th, the balance of history shifted. For the first time, the Ottoman tide had been stopped. From this defeat onward, the empire never regained its former momentum. Expansion gave way to defense. Meanwhile, Europe, so long divided by civil wars and religious strife, now recognized the strength of unity. At the center of that triumph stood John III Sobieski, King of Poland. He was not merely a monarch, but a true general who had personally led the greatest cavalry charge in European history. The image of Sobieski astride his white charger, sword raised high as he led the Winged Hussars, became a symbol of courage and of faith. When he returned to camp, he sent a brief letter to Pope Innocent XIV with the famous words, "Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered. That phrase echoed as an affirmation. Victory at Vienna had come not only by human strength, but by what many believed was divine favor, bestowed upon those who stood firm against the storm. News of the victory spread like wildfire across Europe. In Rome, the bells of the Vatican rang for hours. In Paris, celebrations were held, Sobieski praised as the savior of the continent. In Krakow, crowds flooded the streets, rejoicing that their king had achieved the impossible. Vienna became the very symbol of resilience. Paintings, engravings, and murals of the Winged Hussars' charge spread across Europe, etching the moment into collective memory. To the people, the Battle of Vienna was not merely a victory, it was a miracle. In the wake of Vienna, the balance of power in Europe shifted. The Christian alliance had proven that even an empire as vast as the Ottomans could be defeated if the nations of Europe stood together. This opened a new era, in which European powers gradually drove Ottoman influence back from the Balkans. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat was a devastating shock. They lost tens of thousands of soldiers, along with their stores, artillery, and provisions. More devastating still, They lost the confidence that had sustained them for centuries, the belief that they were invincible. From here, the decline of the empire began to show, its downward path increasingly clear. More than 3 centuries later, when one speaks of Vienna 1683, it is not only the battle that is remembered, it is the unyielding spirit of a small city, the terrifying might of the Winged Hussars charge, and above all, the turning point that reshaped European history. The Battle of Vienna proved that history can pivot in a single moment. When an army thought doomed rises and defeats the greatest power of its age. The victory at Vienna did not just save a city, it saved a continent. It stands as a reminder that even against seemingly unstoppable foes, courage, resilience, and unity can produce miracles. On September 12, 1683, European history took a new course, and upon that path, the mark of Vienna, of John III Sobieski, and of the legendary Winged Hussars echoes still. As the guns fell silent over the fields of Vienna, a new era for Europe began. The battle not only ended 2 months of brutal siege, but left consequences that would reverberate for centuries. Among the names that emerged from the victory at Vienna, none shone brighter than John III Sobieski, King of Poland. The image of him, astride a white charger, sword raised high, leading 20,000 cavalry down from Kahlenberg Hill, instantly became a symbol. To the people of Vienna, he was their savior, and across Europe he was hailed by a new title, the Savior of Europe. It was not only for his courage, but for his ability to bind together a fragile alliance, transforming a patchwork of divided principalities into a coordinated army. In the darkest hour, it was Sobieski who turned despair into hope and division into strength. In Rome, Pope Innocent V praised him as an instrument of God. In Krakow, his people welcomed him home like a father returning from a legendary journey. And in the chronicles of history, Sobieski would forever be remembered as the king who not only saved his own nation, but an entire continent from the Ottoman storm. If Sobieski was the soul of the victory, then the decisive blow belonged to the Winged Hussars. These cavalrymen, with their towering eagle-feathered wings and lances leveled as they charged down from Kahlenberg, carved their names into legend. The sound of the wings shrieking in the wind was described by contemporaries as the cry of avenging angels. For the Ottomans, it was a nightmare. For Europe, a miracle. After Vienna, the image of the Winged Hussars spread across Europe, in paintings, woodcuts, and fireside tales. Children grew up on stories of the warriors with wings who descended like thunder. Even today, the Winged Hussars are celebrated as one of the most formidable cavalry forces in human history, a symbol of courage and unstoppable might. The victory at Vienna proved something greater still, that when Europe was united, no power could subdue it. Before, the German principalities, Poland, Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, all were mired in conflict and rivalry. But Vienna forced them to set aside self-interest and fight for survival as one. In its aftermath, the Christian alliance not only saved Vienna, but created a precedent for future cooperation. It stood as proof that even in a Europe fractured by politics and religion, a common strength could be forged to repel foreign invaders. For the Ottomans, Vienna 1683 was a shattering blow. For centuries, they had believed themselves invincible. But this defeat destroyed not only a campaign, it shattered the myth of Ottoman supremacy. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, mastermind of the siege, was later executed in Belgrade on the Sultan's orders. His death was both a warning and a sign of the instability now seeping into the empire and its heart. From 1683 onward, the Ottomans would never again advance deep into Europe. Instead, they were forced onto the defensive, slowly losing territory in the Balkans. The Battle of Vienna marked the beginning of the decline of an empire that had once made the continent tremble. For the people of Vienna, victory was more than survival. It became a source of eternal pride. The city rebuilt itself. Walls shattered by cannon fire were raised stronger. Churches rang their bells day and night in thanksgiving. Across Europe, artists, poets, and historians celebrated Vienna as a triumph of faith, courage, and military genius. It became the subject of countless paintings, epics, and chronicles. It is no coincidence that centuries later, the Battle of Vienna is still regarded as one of the greatest turning points in human history. It did not merely save a city, it saved a civilization. The legacy of Vienna lives not only in history books, but in Europe's very consciousness. It became the story of unity, of how a small city withstood a vast empire, and how a king chose to ride at the front rather than hide in a palace. That victory reminds us that history is not written by those who have greater numbers, but by those who dare to rise when all seems lost. It affirms that sometimes a single moment, like the charge of the Hussars, can alter the course of the world. The consequences of Vienna were many: the weakening of an empire, the strengthening of an alliance, and the birth of a legend. But its greatest legacy was the lesson it left behind, that unity, courage, and strategic brilliance can reshape the destiny of a continent. On September 12, 1683, it was not only Vienna that was saved, it was all of Europe. And from that day forth, whenever one speaks of the savior of Europe and the Winged Hussars, one recalls not just a battle, but the very moment history itself turned forever.